Erev Tov. This week's parasha is Eikev in the book of Deuteronomy. And on page 1041 in our Chumash, we read a very famous line, V'achalta v'savata uverachta et Adonai Elohecha al haaretz hatova asher natan lach. When you have eaten your fill, you've eaten and you're satisfied, give thanks to the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. That's the basis of Birkat Hamazon, grace after meals, the prayers that we recite after we eat. And I'm imagining that even though Moses gives the Torah and people accepted it, it's going to be 1,500 years later when the rabbis, looking at the Torah, sort of take it apart word by word, phrase by phrase, sometimes letter by letter. And they ask a million questions. And in asking questions about the Torah, they're able to find deeper meaning. They're able to expand the ideas that are mentioned in the Torah. We don't see that process at all. The process that we today would refer to as midrash, the searching, the using the text to find something else that doesn't seem to be in the text. So what I wanted to do was to take this well-known line, you shall eat, you shall be satisfied, you shall bless the Lord your God. And imagine if Joshua was a rabbi from the Mishnah or the Talmud 1,500 years later, and what he might have done with this very simple line. Again, you eat, you're satisfied, you bless the Lord. What's the question? It's pretty clear. But the rabbis, it's never clear. There's always something beneath the level that we read. And here I'm imagining Joshua acting as a rabbi and performing the same function on the text. So here are 10 questions to this very simple line, you shall eat and be satisfied and bless the Lord. Joshua's questions for Moses. Number 1, is it just eating that requires a blessing? What about drinking? Because again, the word seems to say, v'achalta, when you eat and you are satisfied. But is that really all that Moses meant? Suppose somebody gets a drink of water or a drink of wine or a soda, an iced tea. There's a blessing that's supposed to be said before. There's also a blessing that's supposed to be said after. And all you're having, it's not a full meal. It's just a drink. And yet, there's a blessing before and a blessing after. And Joshua seems to anticipate that by saying, when you say eat, do you mean eat or do you mean eat in a broader sense? Take in anything. So question number 2. Suppose you chew something but you don't swallow it. Does that also require a blessing? Like, for instance, chewing gum, right? Does that fall into the category of you shall eat and be satisfied? Okay, rabbis will ask that question. Clearly, Moses didn't have to talk about that. Number 3, if you ingest something for healing purposes, does that require a blessing too, even if the taste is bitter? So what about a pill? What about medication? What about bitter medication? you shall eat and you shall be satisfied. You shall bless the Lord. What do you do in that case? Is it medicine, or is it only something that tastes good? You know what? There's a lot of times that people will eat things, the hottest chilies or other kinds of food, don't necessarily have a pleasant taste, but that would certainly fall into the category. But what about very bitter food? Do you eat, should you say a blessing over the horseradish at the Passover Seder? And we know the answer there is yes. Okay, number 4. What exactly does satisfied mean? You shall eat and you shall be satisfied. Is it quantity, being full, or is it quality, having enjoyment from the food? So imagine people who are practically starving and they eat something, but they walk away still craving more food. Their stomach isn't full. If you've tasted something, just a little bit, and you're still hungry, you're not satisfied, then what do we mean? What are you supposed to do? Do you say the blessing or not? Number 5, should the blessing be recited before or after eating the food? So every movie that we've seen about pious Christians, for what, we say grace before we eat, for what we are about to receive, may the Lord make us truly thankful. And everybody knows, even people who aren't Jewish, people who aren't that religious, that you have to say a motzi at a wedding or at a bar mitzvah or a bris. And yet, the truth of the matter is, the blessing, the verse here says, when you have eaten and you are satisfied, you shall bless the Lord. The actual commandment is what you do after the meal, not what you do before. So the question is, where did we get the whole idea of saying the motzi from? That's not commanded. Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, is directly from the Torah. What about number 6? Should the blessing be short and concise, or should it be more extensive, providing us with opportunities during the day to praise and thank God? This is an interesting concept. Is the purpose of saying the blessing after you have eaten and been satisfied to simply thank God for the food? Or is it an opportunity to stop and to pray and to commune with God about things other than the food that you just ate? And of course, that happens to be the case. So we see that it's not just about thanks to God for the food we just ate, but this is an opportunity to thank God for the food and for a lot of other things as well. Number 7, what should the nature of the blessing be? A specific prayer to God for each and every particular food. Should there be a separate prayer for each of the 7 species you just mentioned? Right before this, God says, when you come into the land, you will be blessed with wheat and with barley and with grapes and figs and pomegranates and olives and dates. Okay? Those 7 things seem to be extra special. So is there a separate prayer for each of the 7 species you just mentioned? Wheat, barley, etc. As well as for meat, fowl, fish, every other variety of food, or one all-purpose general blessing for food. We know, most people are aware, that when you have bread at a meal, all you need to do is say the motzi, the blessing over the bread. And that covers everything else. But if you don't have bread, and there could be a half a dozen different things that you eat and that you're tasting during the course of the meal, if there isn't bread, then you need to say a separate blessing over each and every separate item. But if you do start with bread, bread covers it all. Okay, so number 8. What should the content of the blessing be? Thanking God for providing us with food, or thanking God for the land which we call our own, because it says, when you've eaten your fill, give thanks to the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. So it's not even that you're saying thank you for the meal we just ate. It's thank you for the land of Israel that gave us a place where we could grow our own food. So immediately we say, well, what about if you're not living in the land of Israel? And yet, even in America, no matter where you live, after you eat, we're still thanking God for Israel. So, that's another of our very strong connections to the land of Israel. And if the blessing is about the land, do we still recite it if we are not in the land? What if we are not in the land, but are eating food grown in the land? Right? So you can imagine how rabbis in the Talmud would break down every single aspect of this. And finally, not yet, number 9, in our blessing, do we only thank God, or should we include the farmers and shepherds who grew or raised the food? And what about the people who prepared and cooked the food? Another interesting question. Jewish tradition and law, it's really all about God and thanking God. But, are we being negligent by not saying, and thank you for the farmers who worked so hard to produce this food for us? And thanks to Mom, who slaved over an oven to make the food. Those things don't seem to be part of the rabbinic answer. Should we change? Are we lacking something? And should that be added to our modern Birkat Hamazon? And then finally, number 10, should the Kohanes and the Levites create standardized blessings that we all use, or should it be left up to every individual to create their own personal prayers and blessings to God? You may not know this, but in the Amidah, originally, the idea was there were 18 first and then later 19 themes that you were to speak about. The blessing was fixed, but the paragraph was left to each individual. That everybody said, okay, I'm now coming to the paragraph that deals with health. God heals those who are sick. You're supposed to have taken a moment to have devised your own personal prayer and meditation on people that you know who are sick, asking specifically that God heal them. And then we all come together with the blessing that summarizes the theme. But most people can't do that. They certainly can't do it day after day after day. So ultimately, the entire paragraph of each of the paragraphs of the Amidah was fixed. And the question is, well, what about Birkat Hamazon? Should at every meal people take a moment to add their personal prayers about the food I just ate and how I feel about it and the people I'm sitting with? Eventually, people couldn't do that. So what ultimately happened is a text was created, and it's quite an extensive text When we have our Shabbat dinners, we use an abridged text. But actually, traditionally, it goes on for pages and pages. So that too is part of this idea. So the notion of Birkat Hamazon and all the questions that it raises and all the possibilities comes out of just a few words. And now you can begin to understand how the Talmud worked, how the rabbis created Rabbinic Judaism by asking one question after another, delving, digging, uncovering, searching for the meaning in each and every single phrase and word and what it's all about. Okay, we're moving on to chapter 10 of the book of Deuteronomy. Here's another example of using something that maybe seems pretty clear, but actually, if we apply the rabbinic method, the Talmudic method of questioning everything, maybe it raises a lot of issues that we never even thought about. So on page 1048, chapter 10 in the book of Deuteronomy, we read in verse 12, "And now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God demand of you?" This is Moses in year 40, about to say goodbye to the people, and ultimately he summarizes and he says, okay, listen up. You know what God wants from you? And here's what it says. Only this. Notice the word only this. To revere the Lord your God, to walk only in his paths, to love him, and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, keeping the Lord's commandments and laws, which I enjoin upon you today for your good. So 4 things there. Revere the Lord your God, walk in his paths, love him, serve him. Okay? So now we imagine Talmudic rabbis taking apart, if they were with Moses then, they might have asked the following questions. They weren't, and so it took another 1,500 years before these kind of questions might have been asked. Number 1, when it says to revere Adonai your God. Wait a minute. The Hebrew word here is yirah. That could mean a couple things. It could mean fear God, or it could also mean be in awe of God, right? Or to revere God. Which is it? Fear, revere. Both are translations of yirah. Which one was intended? Each one has a different meaning. What exactly, Moses, are you asking of me? Right? If you're going to fear God, it's the notion of your relationship with this powerful, stern father figure, and at every moment you gotta sort of be looking over your shoulder, making sure you don't mess up because you can get smacked for doing anything. That's fear. Is that what our religion is about? And Moses said, that's what I want you to do. Yirah. Is it fear God? That's your relationship with your God. Or is it I want you to revere God, to be in awe of God? And there it's like, wow, I can't believe how incredible, how magnificent God is. And every time I take a step, it's not that I'm fearfully looking over my shoulder. It's that I look around and I am just in wonder at the incredible things that God can do and did do and will do for us. So that's the first question. Number 2, to walk in all his ways. Moses says, it's very simple. I want you to walk in the ways of God. beautiful cliche. Wait a minute, what does that mean? Hold on. How is it possible for a human being to walk in God's ways? And all of them, no doubt. It doesn't say, try to imitate God whenever you can. It says, walk in God's ways. All of them. If we could do that, then wouldn't we be God? If you could do the same thing that God would do? So what exactly does Moses mean when he says, it's very simple, walk in the ways of God? And then it says, to love him. All I want you to do is love God. Stop. How can you command love? We're not even commanded to love our mother. Think about it. The commandment, the 10 Commandments, kabedet avicha v'yerimecha, is honor your father and your mother. Nowhere does it say love your mother and your father. But it does say, I want you to love God. How can you be commanded to love? Either you do or you don't. What's going on, right? So that's an incredible, thing that we need to understand. Especially after we experience a tragic death in our own lives, or a terrible illness, or a natural disaster. We're still supposed to love God. There's a disconnect there. What do you want from us, Moses? How do you expect us to deal with tragedy and with suffering in life? Can we do both things at the same time? Look, there are some very pious people who, when they get smacked, they say, thank you, do you want to do it again? And I'm willing to take anything you're giving. Most people are not like that. Okay, number 4, to worship God with all your heart and all your soul. Just a minute. It's hard enough to just show up and open the book and say the prayers on a Friday night, on a Saturday at a minyan. You want to require me to say them with complete feeling and devotion. That's an ideal goal, but not a realistic one. I want you to worship God with all your heart and with all your soul. Serve God, which means to worship God, to pray with all. Look, I'm going to show up. Don't ask more of me. How can you change your attitude? Sometimes I don't want to be here. Sometimes I don't feel like I want to praise God and be in love with God. So what do you want from me, Moses? And then it says to keep God's commands and all his laws. Okay, sure. The 10 Commandments, that's probably something that we could do. But wait a minute. There's more than 10 Commandments, Moses? How many are there? What? 613? You've got to be kidding. And you've got the chutzpah to say, only this is what I ask of you. Just follow the 613 commandments. You can't be serious. And Moses would probably respond and say, yes, this is what God is asking of you. And yes, God is being serious. So it's hard to be a Jew, and there's a lot to know and a lot to do. And yes, even though Moses says only these few things, but we understand it's much more complicated than that. Okay, next we turn on page 1053, and we read the following. You're all familiar with this. Therefore, impress these words upon your very heart. Bind them as a sign on your hand, and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. There's a couple of places and times when we read the laws that are the basis of wearing tefillin. This is one of them. In chapter 11 in the book of Deuteronomy. And it says, take all these words that God has given you, and you should bind these words, tie these words as a sign on your arm and as a reminder on your forehead. Okay? So that's the commandment that the rabbis later understood and interpreted as tefillin. Tefillin, of course, 2 black boxes with leather straps. We wear it on the bicep opposite the heart, 7 times straps around the arm. And then we have on the hand, we make a shin with the straps. And then we wear also at the hairline, we wear tefillin, and 2 black straps come down. These are worn weekdays in the morning. What's inside the tefillin? Not the whole Torah, not even the whole book of Deuteronomy. Actually, there are 4 paragraphs inside the tefillin, the 4 times that it says you shall take these words and bind them as a sign upon your arm. So there we're wearing those words that refer to this particular mitzvah. Now, were there tefillin in the days of Moses or Joshua or King David or Solomon? We don't think so. We don't have any proof. It's never been dug up. We did dig up tefillin that go back to the time of Masada or Bar Kokhba. In other words, the 1st century, 2nd century. But between Moses saying, bind these words as a sign upon your arm, and the first pair of tefillin, we actually can say, we can date this back to the 1st century. We're talking about more than 1,000 years. So the question becomes, so when did this idea develop of taking this line and actually making it into a ritual object? We don't know. Impossible to say. I wanted to examine this idea from another point of view. And so I've created the following little story, and it's complex, so I'll explain as we go along. Morning minyan. We entered the shul and put on our davening uniform, kippah, talit, tefillin. There's a variety in head coverings, less so in our prayer shawls. But when it comes to our tefillin, the square black boxes and black leather straps all look the same, or so it seemed at first glance. Look, people come to shul, somebody's wearing a black yarmulke, somebody's got a knit yarmulke, a more orthodox person may be wearing his black hat. You may find a guy with a baseball hat, on a weekday morning. All different possibilities. Talis, maybe you're going to have one that looks like a bar mitzvah talis, that's more like a scarf. Maybe you're going to have more of the large talises that people wrap themselves in. Okay, there's some variety, not a lot. Tefillin all look the same. Black box, black strap. All tefillin are the same, right? Wrong. Ruvain's boxes are gasot. You go into a Jewish bookstore and say, I want a pair of tefillin. They're not going to just say, here's what we got. There's a half a dozen questions that they're going to have to ask you. Do you want gasot? One thick piece of leather which is allowed to harden for a year. Or Shimon, who's sitting here wearing tefillin, he's got pshutim, several pieces of thin leather which are glued together. So you can imagine that you're going to pay a lot more for the gasot, one thick piece of leather that's shaped and that hardens, as opposed to, which will be much cheaper, thin pieces of leather which are put together and glued together. There's another type. Levi is wearing dakot. These are similar to the pshutim, meaning a number of thin pieces of leather, but with a single thin frame of leather stretched over the glued pieces. So you can imagine you're going to pay a different price for the gasot, for the pshutim, for the dakot. Yehuda is Ashkenazi. His people come from Eastern Europe. And his tefillin were written by a sofer with the Beit Yosef script. Calligraphers, scribes, have, depending on where they come from, not just their own artistic nature or ability, but their traditions. So Ashkenazic scribes use one font, one different kind of font than what other people will use. It's called the Beit Yosef. Issachar, on the other hand, is Sephardi. And so the font that was used by the scribe to write the pieces of parchment in his tefillin, they use what's called the Velish style of letters. Okay, then we've got Zvulun, who's with us at the Minyan. He's a Chosid, and his tefillin were written by a scribe in the Ari tradition. Ari was living in the 16th century. Isaac Luria, one of the great mystics of Jewish tradition, lived in Safed. And Hasidim follow the traditions of the Ari. Benny, on the other hand, stands and wraps the leather strap counterclockwise towards his heart. So he puts on the tefillin and then he does the straps towards himself this way. Okay? He sees the letter shin on the back of his hand. And if you do it this way, ultimately, when you come to the hand piece, you're going to make it so that it looks like there's a shin right over there. Dan sits while putting on his tefillin, and he winds the strap clockwise away from his heart. There are some people who go towards you yourself. Other people, you put the straps on your arm going away from yourself. And when you do it that way, you're going to end up with a shin that comes out the other way. Not this way, but what would look like upside down. Naphtali, like most Jews, wear what's called Rashid Filling. The 4 sections in the headpiece are placed in the box left to right, following the order that the passages appear in the Torah. So first passage is in Exodus 13. So we got that one on the left. Then comes next to it, V'haya ki yaviecha. That's a little bit later in the same chapter. That follows it, so it goes next. Then you have the Shema in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And then the 4th piece is the one we're actually talking about right now, Deuteronomy 11. So if you have the 4 passages inside the tefillin, in the order that they come in the Torah, that's called Rashi tefillin. Rashi, of course, was the great commentator and teacher, lived in France in the 11th century. Gadi, after the Amida, takes off his Rashi tefillin and he puts on a set of Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, in which the 4th passage comes before the 3rd. The rabbis actually argued about What should be the proper order in the headpiece of the four pieces? Most people say it should go in the order that they come in the Torah. That's the Rashid Filling. But there are other people who say, no, we should switch the third and the fourth. Well, that approach was accepted by Rashi's grandson, who's known as Rabbeinu Tam. So while everybody will put on a pair of Rashid Filling, very pious people, in order to make sure they've got both opinions covered, they will take off the first set and put on a second set of tefillin during the same service that has them with a different order, right? So we've got that. Asher is a mystic, and he wears what's called Shimusha Rabbah tefillin, in which the four sections are placed right to left, not left to right, so that they are the opposite of the Rashi tefillin. And again, for all these complex, mystical, technical, legalistic, or spiritual reasons, depending on how you feel about it, rabbis fought, no, it should be this way, no, it should be that way, no, it should be in this order, no, it should be in that order. Okay? Yosef, who is also a Kabbalist, wears the tefillin of the Ra'avad. Okay, Rabbi Abraham ben David lived in the 13th century, in which the order of the passages is the reverse of those in the Rabbeinu Tam. Ephraim, when he places the box on his bicep, he wears the leather strap over the edges of the box in such a way that it forms the letter shin. There are some people they put on, then the strap just goes on the arm. Some people put on the tefillin, and then the strap actually goes on top of the platform of the box. So that is a mystical approach. Menashe, after wrapping the leather strap 7 times around his arm, brings it up and around his middle finger before bringing it down and around the back of his hand. Moshe has the knot on the back of his head strap tied in the shape of the letter Dalet. If you get a basic tefillin, cheaper ones, and you look at the knot that's on the back, right, of the head, you'll just see it's like 4 pieces that are together. But on more elaborate and expensive, they've tied it in such a way so that it's not a square of 4 pieces, one next to another, but it's actually a dalet. So you've got 1, 2, nothing here, and then 1 down there. So it looks like the letter dalet, as in Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, last letter of the line of the Shema. Aaron has his knot tied into a square, like most of us do. Saul wears tefillin on Chol HaMoed, and David doesn't. This is another argument and debate among the rabbis and the Jews. Chol HaMoed are the intermediate days of Sukkot and Passover. Among some Jews, the tradition is you don't wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed because Chol HaMoed is considered a holiday, and we don't wear tefillin on Shabbat or on full Yantiv. So therefore, you don't wear them on Chol HaMoed either. But there are other Jews who say, you know what, if you're going to go to work, do you take off the whole week of Passover? If you do, then it's a real holiday for 8 days. But if you don't, if you only take off for the Seders and maybe for the end, for, saying Yisker, but you would go to work in the middle or you'd go to school, then it's not really a full class holiday, and therefore you should put on tefillin. In Israel, by the way, nobody wears tefillin during Chol HaMoed, but here in America, it depends, customs differ. Sitting in the back of the shul is Dinah, the only woman wearing tefillin, which are covered by pink talis. Used to be that women never would wear a talis or tefillin, but I got to tell you, in the last 25, 30, 40 years, there are a growing number of women who do wear a talit, and on weekdays put on tefillin. So that's something that you won't see everywhere you go. And here in shul with us is God, who is also wearing tefillin. According to the Talmud, God's tefillin have a different passage inside them than ours do. There's a beautiful passage in the Talmud that imagines that God wears tefillin. But God's tefillin doesn't say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." God's tefillin say, "Who is like you, people of Israel?" A unique people on earth. We all are wearing tefillin this morning, fulfilling the mitzvah in the Torah. You shall bind them as a sign upon your hand, and they shall be as a reminder above your eyes. But it seems that each of us has our own unique way of interpreting how this mitzvah is to be performed. On the outside, things may all look the same. But once you delve inside, we find out how different we all are. And yet, we still manage to daven together. And again, even think about this, the way that, we have in common the idea of Shabbos. But everybody observes Shabbos in their own particular way. A Hasidic Shabbos is not going to be the same as people in our shul. Maybe in our shul it consists of you light candles, you come to shul, maybe that's it. Maybe there's a few more things. But what we have in common is Shabbos, how we interpret it, and the details, that's one of the differences. Okay, so we come to our Haftorah, and we're again in the cycle of 7 Haftorahs that follow Tisha B'Av and lead us to Rosh Hashanah. These are called the Haftarah de Nechemta, Shiva de Nechemta, the 7 of comfort and consolation, because all of them come from the prophet Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, who came to Babylonia after 550 BCE and brought a message to the people. God still loves us. God's going to bring us back. All will be well. So I wanted to share this. And remember, my approach to the Haftorahs is this. These are all beautiful speeches. Most of them are, we don't remember or know the context. The words may be very difficult. But to me, the prophet originally, it was street theater. He got up and he did something which drew people's attention and made them think. The words were secondary to what he was performing. And it was more out of his performance than it was out of his words that touched people. So here's this week's example. Hey, Navi, prophet, why do you bring us these words of consolation? God has forsaken us. He has forgotten us. Remember, these are people who were survivors, who were dragged off as slaves, hundreds of miles from their home. Their relatives were dead. Their temple was destroyed. And here's this guy in Babylonia saying, God loves you. He's taken us back. And the people after a while said, I don't think so. The prophet took in the words of rebuke from the crowd. He searched for what to answer. Then he saw a woman holding an infant in her arms. He walked up to her and took the child into his arms. Then he turned his back on the mother and he walked away. The woman followed after him, unsure of what he was going to do with her child. And then he stops and he looks at the crowd holding her baby, and he said, notice that she followed him. Can a woman forget her own child? Can a mother ever disown the child of her womb? The woman shook her head. No. The prophet handed the infant back to her. God will never forget Zion. He will never disown Israel. Okay, so, with this little play, taking a baby, walking away, and wait a minute, where you going with that baby? Just as a mother could never abandon a child, God could never abandon his people, his baby, Israel. He looked around him and he saw a piece of charcoal on the ground. He picked it up and used it to scrawl something on the palm of his hand. Then he lifted his hand to the crowd and he showed them the 4 letters he had written. Sadi, Yud, Vav, Nun. Sadi, Vav. Right? Sadi, Yud, Vav, Nun. Sion, Zion. God has engraved you on the palm of his hand. Not only will he never forget you, he will soon bring you back to your land. So Zion, of course, is another name for Jerusalem. It's another way of saying the country of Israel, where the Jewish people live. And again, although the text speaks about God is engraving himself, your land on his hand, he will not forget you, right? By showing it, by doing it, and saying, God can't forget you, because he's tattooed the Jewish people and their homeland onto his hand. Okay? Still, some people in the crowd were not buying it. God turned his back on us, and with good reason. We sinned. He's had it with us. He let our enemies conquer our city, burn our temple, slaughter our people. God made it clear he wants to have nothing to do with us. The prophet listened to this challenge and again thought about how to respond. He spied a man standing with his wife. He pulled them next to him and he had them face one another. Picking up a stick, the prophet drew a square in the dirt between the husband and wife. Then he etched into the square the words, Hare at muteret lechol adam. Those are the words that are found, the key words that are found on a get. When a man divorces his wife, a document has to be given to her. And on the document, it says, Hare at, behold, you are muteret, you're now permitted to marry lechol adam, anyone else, because we're no longer husband and wife. So the prophet takes these people, has them face each other, writes this document in the dirt between them, the words of a get, and everybody looking at that would immediately know what this is. It's that Isaiah is saying, you're divorced. You're not married anymore. Everyone pushed closer to see what he had written. When they saw the words that were part of a get, a divorce document, they were shocked. The man, the husband, was so upset that with his foot he rubbed out all the letters scratched into the dirt. He took his wife's hand and moved back into the crowd. And the prophet looks at the man and he says, "You did well, my friend." That's exactly what God did to the get that he wrote. He destroyed it. God will never divorce the Jewish people. The time has come when he will take us back. And as the crowd dispersed, many shook their heads and thought, maybe the prophet is right. And again, all of those images, all of those words are written in the Haftorah. When we read them as a speech, they go over our head. But when you see them as three little plays, people understand, right? And even though when we read it, some 2,500 years later, it's like we're reading Shakespeare. The words don't make much sense to us. If you saw these three little skits, you would understand completely what Isaiah is saying. That God is our mother, God is our husband, and God is our lover. God will never forget us. So those are some of the lessons that we derive from this week's Torah portion, Eikev. We'll take a break for a few minutes and we'll daven at 8:30.